Okay, so let's get started. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our third session in this really interesting series that we have underway. I'm going to skip all the preliminaries so that we can get right to the good stuff and turn it over to Mark with Erewhon. Mark.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone, for attending again. I'm going to begin with a program note, as they say. Our 7-part series is going to pivot on this central session tonight, the fourth of 7. I'm sorry, it's going to pivot next time, the fourth of 7, when with The Handmaid's Tale and then 2 later, Station 11 and Cloud Cuckoo Land, we move into the 20th century, 21st century, 20th and 21st, and a more modern sensibility. And tonight's book, Erewhon, is the kind of cusp of that pivot. It's a Victorian novel. It is only about 160 years old. Some of you may know Samuel Butler from The Way of All Flesh. The issues about artificial intelligence, the connection that is thin to some of the utopias beforehand, but it very much being a novel of its time, leads me to hope that you've engaged with enough that I can leave much of the discussion to you. The second program note is I have said to this Zoom room before that 2 of the ways you could approach literature, there are many ways. One is to delve into a particular period or author or work in a depth way that I use the metaphor of being geological, that you're mining a particular site and the teacher, the presenter, the group is looking to know a lot about this author or this particular book. Another way, complementary, different, not right or wrong, is the survey that this course is, a survey of literary utopias, where the issue is not geologically motivated, but topographical, a kind of lay of the land. I have always found that a congenial pairing of metaphors. I think my students have too. And when you do that kind of survey, you're not going to go in depth on any one book. You notice that the conversation about Utopia, Moore's Utopia, as a literary work was generalized and culturally plotted. The same thing is going to be true tonight. It's going to be more of a survey. When I have done over the past few years, the many lectures on the American novel or the modern British novel, that's been a kind of hybrid. We've talked in great detail about the individual works in the broad and kind of generalized view of what is an American novel. But a literary survey of utopias is much more specific than the great American novel. And so tonight is going to have a survey feel to it. I'm going to give you some sense of the lay of the land. But I'm hoping that you as readers, Zoom tells me there are over 50 of you. And in fact, I have your names. And in some cases, I know where you live. So when I make my introductory comments, I am going to turn it over and ask if you will jump into the breach and talk about your reaction to the book. So the first thing to know about Samuel Butler is that he was the son of a father who was the son of a father who was a prominent religious teacher. His father was someone who wanted to join the Navy, Thomas Butler, but acceded to his father's wishes and instead became a priest in the Church of England. He didn't have a very distinctive career. Having been thwarted in his own plans, he decided to thwart the plans of his son. Samuel Butler's dates are 1835 to 1902, almost exactly the span of Queen Victoria's reign. 1835 is 2 years before she took the throne. 1902, when he died, is 1 year after she died. Until the current or the recently deceased queen, she had the longest reign of any monarch in history. He wanted to do something other than join the priesthood, but his parents were very oppressive, very antagonistic. especially his father. He wrote in one of his notebooks that his parents were brutal and stupid by nature. So he set on a course for the priesthood, but he didn't have his heart in it. He didn't thrive in what we call high school. He did okay at St. John's, they call it St. John's College at Cambridge. He obtained a first in classics. He began his career as an Anglican priest in a very low income parish in London, where he served for a year. And then at the end of that year, at the age of 84, he emigrated to New Zealand. He there wrote of his life as a profitable sheep farmer in a book that you can get called A First Year in Canterbury Settlement, published in 1863. So he's still a young man. He's 26. And he collected a lot of materials for Erewhon while he was there. In 1863, 4 years after Darwin's Origin of Species came out, he published a letter in a New Zealand paper called The Press, where he predicted, this is his phrase, machine evolution, and that in time, the human race would be inferior to the machines. I'm going to say the date again, 1863. Remarkable. If you read Erewhon, you've read those chapters on the machines, and this is the center of what many people remember this novel for. So when we talk about dystopias, that the progress of mankind, Darwin's brilliance in seeing evolution in natural selection, the advance of technology in the 19th century when industry became a dominant factor in human culture, combine to make a dystopia that he imagines and that we are partly, whether it's a dystopia or not, living through about the machines taking over. I had this very much on my mind when I put this on our syllabus. He returned to England in 1864, having sold his sheep farm for a lot of money, except for brief excursions and spending almost every summer in Italy. He lived there for the rest of his life, which was over 35 years. He scraped for money until his father died in 1886. He's 51, and that resolved his financial problems, and he lived until 1901. In that period, after he published this book, he left directions that The Way of All Flesh, which was a thinly veiled autobiographical novel about his relationship with his father, should not be published until after his death, because it is deeply and emotionally bitter about Victorian England. So you have a person who stands in odd relations to his time. He is someone who believes in evolution, but he doesn't identify himself as an adherent of Darwin because he has some issues with Darwin's methods. He believes in natural selection. He believes in evolution. And even though he was not a churchman for his career, he also did not have the Darwinians despising of spiritual dimensions in the Christian church. It's not so much that he belonged to both worlds, is that he stood outside of both worlds. And so he was he's kind of a sport or a freak in Victorian culture. But he was sensitive enough to his reputation, rather than sensitive to his father's feelings, not to have The Way of All Flesh be published in his lifetime. Now, of course, The Way of All Flesh is corruption and death, and he uses that as a title because he means to emphasize the way of all flesh is to die, not to be born again. And this was a period in English history, especially England, partly Europe, but English history, when we're talking about the end of the century. 1872 is when this book was published. He lived for the rest of the century. When people are becoming very traumatized by the fear that there is no afterlife. This is the time in the world when Nietzsche said, Gott ist tot, which rhymes in German, God is dead. A number of Victorians felt that in order to be intellectuals and modern people who respected science and the world of facts, they could not believe that a man walked on water or rose from the dead. They were desperate to try to keep the ethics of Christianity, but the problem was many people of the age would not accept the ethics without the other paraphernalia. George Eliot, after Dickens, the most preeminent Victorian novelist, said that the prayer of the contemporary Englishman is, "Dear God, if there is a God, save my soul if I have a soul." And another poet wrote that when you read the Bible, it's a very interesting plot, but the plot has counterplot. It may be, and it may be not. And so you get these works of art, literary works of art, as early as the 1840s with the Christmas Carol, in which the period and the writers try to have the ethics of their religion without the religion. So what does Tiny Tim and the Christmas Carol teach us? That you can redeem yourself by being charitable to other people. Will you go to heaven? Four spirits visit Ebenezer on Christmas Eve, and not one of them has anything to do with the New or Old Testament. He's visited by Jacob Marley, his old partner, and three different versions of the Christmas spirit, one of which looks like somebody out of Ingmar Bergman. What is the fear that the last hooded character puts into Scrooge? Not that he will go to hell, that he will be forgotten and maligned in this life after his death. It is very secular. It is very this world, even though Dickens hopes that people, when they hear Tiny Tim say, "God bless us, everyone," will feel that that's what human charity is about. That's that community of charitable people that I've been talking about, not just because that's what I believe in the world, but because that's in these novels. And the spirits did it all in one night. A Christmas Carol is called a Christmas Carol, a Christmas song. It was published in the Christmas season. There was an attempt to make gift versions of it. It was published in a Christian country. And yet Jesus Christ by name does not appear in the book once. Tiny Tim says to his family, who say to him, "You must feel bad when people look at you with pity on Christmas morning when you go to church." And he said, "No, I'm happy to think that I give them reason to remember he who healed the lame." But he who healed the lame does not have a name in A Christmas Carol, because Dickens is trying to write to Victorians who want to believe in the charity without believing in the doctrine. And that becomes very powerful. That's partly how many 20th century Christians live their lives. George Eliot made a religion out of it, a religion of humanity, she called it, that's based on fellow feeling, compassion for other people. And I'll end this by saying the great 18th century philosopher and economist, the Scottish author Adam Smith, wrote this: "To feel much for others and little for ourselves, to restrain our selfishness and exercise our benevolent affections, this constitutes the perfection of human nature." That spirit of what he says as an 18th century writer, a writer of reason, is what animates almost all of the writers of this survey. That the problem with utopias is that they believe in reason rather than kindness. And so here there is a nod towards a non-English sea captain, an Italian who picks them up. He's abused because they lie to him. There is some reference to a kind of utopian world, but mainly from very early on when he's arrested for having a watch. This is very much a novel about a satire on Victorian society, where to be ill is to be a criminal, and very much a dystopia, but not in the extreme sense of what we'll see in some of our later works, especially next time's Handmaid's Tale. So I'll say more later about what's being published around the time that this is published. But having spoken for a chunk of time, I would like to know and ask Michael again to MC. Would someone like to say something about how you found the novel in the context of this series so far?
Okay, folks, I think we know the drill. Use the Q&A button to send me any responses to Mark's prompt just now. When I reread parts of this novel just before today, I focused on the machine chapters, which I hope some of you, many of you have read, because it is absolutely, as Mark said, fascinating the way some things are. He's presented some things in those machine chapters which can be directly talked about and related to things going on today. I mean, the concept of natural evolution applying to the evolutionary development of machines, things that the artificial intelligence scientists are doing right now. The ideas kicking around that the machines will someday become so far superior to us that they take over the world and we're sort of like dogs and horses and other domesticated animals. Very serious, intelligent people are talking about those things right now. So it's really fascinating. Anyway, so comments, questions from the folks. I'm ready to go. Patricia says, I found the book more interesting intellectually than Gulliver's Travels, but less appealing in terms of a strong narrative.
Yeah, I think that's a comment that I wholeheartedly endorse. And I'm sorry, who was that who said that?
Patricia.
And Patricia, I'll say more. I would guess that's a lot of people's response. He's not looking at making a compelling narrative. Even people who have read the book and admire its argument or are struck by its prophetic nature, I don't think anyone thinks it's a compelling read. Whereas Swift is so vivacious and audacious in his satire and so wickedly funny. And sometimes, even though he can be very cruel about humanity, almost always entertaining. And it has more of a travelogue feeling, Gulliver's Travels, and the strangeness of being in other places. Yeah, here he goes to a new place. It turns out you don't have to sail there, you can walk through a passageway. It's a lot like, in some ways, the New Zealand he's living in. Even though it's far away, it's an actual place, New Zealand, known to many, many 19th century citizens because they have relatives who have gone there. And it has a propagandist issue that's clearer, the issue of technology, the issue of evolution, the issue of the absence of kindness in the Victorian society, that is less subtle than Gulliver's Travels. So you won't find this novel being made into a children's book, or for that matter, a movie. I don't know if there are movie versions of Erewhon. Please don't look it up. We can all find out easily. But it's a very different kind of book. I agree. Intellectually, there's more to chew on, maybe. It's not an engaging read. The Way of All Flesh, I recommend to you, is a very good read. And very complicated in its double stance as being a work of fiction that's really a thinly veiled autobiography.
Lynn has thrown out the question, does this remind anybody of 2001?
Yeah, let me answer that question, even though she put it towards everybody. I am doing this season a 3-part series by Zoom at the Richfield Library on technology gone awry. The librarian there wrote to me some months ago and said to me, with all this stuff about chatbot, I'd like to do some fiction on artificial intelligence, but I don't want to do chatbot. How about novels where things get messed up? Are there such books? I wrote back immediately and say, yes, back in the 1960s, Arthur Clarke wrote 2001, A Space Odyssey. What's the matter, Dave? Where Hal runs amok. And whether it's the Arnold Schwarzenegger Terminator movies or the Matthew Broderick War Games movies, or whether what we know now about computers who can not just be like human beings, but can be indistinguishable human beings. Now they're mastering voice duplication. So we are doing a three-part series, a novel by Ian McEwan. I hope Michael won't mind this brief commercial for what can't be a competitor. Michael McEwan some years ago wrote Machines Like Me. Ishiguro wrote Clara and the Sun, which was more well-read and better received. And then a sci-fi novel by a woman writer named Clark called A Closed and Comet Orbit. It turns out you can't avoid sci-fi when you're talking about things going awry. And it was important to me that at least one of the three writers be a woman. So we'll see examples of that. But yes, 2001: A Space Odyssey, Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove. You could look at almost any movie by Stanley Kubrick, and the moral is whatever you plan gets mucked up. It's not always about technology, but it is in Dr. Strangelove, and it is in 2001. And I'm old enough now to be a curmudgeon, and I do worry that it's going to be very hard to stop machines getting better than us because we made them better. And when we're figuring out how to wire them, what buttons to push inside, that Adam Smith quote about acts of benevolence and suppressing our selfishness in favor of others, where's the program for that? It's a tough call. We don't want robots to be kinder. We want them to be more efficient. And one of the ways to be more efficient is to be less kind, is to be less humane. There is a recorded announcement when you leave the parking lot at the Yale Health Plan. I'm retired, but I still go there. And the machine says to you when it lifts the arm, drive safely or get home safe. There's nobody saying that to me. The voice box, it says, put the ticket in with the stripe up and to the right, up and to the right. It wishes you a good drive. I had a long conversation with my Yale-educated son as to what are we to make of that. It's not a person saying it. It's just a recording. Are we supposed to think that's a kind thing? That's a nice touch? I don't know. Other comments before I tell you something about the context of the terrain in which this novel was published?
Yeah, we've got a couple more. One of them, the second one, I think may be a little bit of a good jumping off point for you, but we'll do the first one first. So, did Samuel, if you know, did Samuel Butler believe, as Emily Dickinson and in Robinson's novel Housekeeping that we read, that the hunger of wanting is more valuable than the having?
Who asked that question?
Janet.
Janet?
Yeah.
So, Janet, I commend you on referring to two of my favorite books and quoting one of the novels we talked about and the way we talked about it. I'm not sure. My first response, and I don't know him anywhere as well as I know Dickinson and even Housekeeping, I'm not sure he would frame it that way. For one thing, the kind of wanting, the kind of need in both those artists is pitched as female. I'm not saying it's a fact of life, but in those works, the poems of Dickinson and certainly Marilyn Robinson's Housekeeping, A House of Women, it's very much pitched as a female need to want. You would call it back in the old days when you could get away with discrimination, a female plot. A female plot was a plot like Little Women, where the women succeed in their careers, but they also remain sisters to one another. That was considered back in the early 20th century a female plot because it emphasized community and fellow feeling. A male plot was Dickens having a plot in which the protagonist, David Copperfield, gets a better bride and a good career. That male plots are about attaining power and status. and female plots are about keeping relationships. So I don't think he would think in terms of hunger. I do think he sees himself as a product of Victorian society who is outside it. I think his going to New Zealand had as much symbolic value as logistical value. He was almost certainly a closeted homosexual. He had uh, many contacts with a woman who some of his biographers say maybe satisfied his repressed sexual desire. But he had many male friends, also single. One of them lived nearby. He cultivated a lifelong bachelorhood. And when Oscar Wilde's trial resulted in his imprisonment near the end of the century, he became very spooked by any notion that people would think that he was a homosexual. He wasn't famous the way Wilde was, but he was a published author. He lived on Fleet Street in England. He was something of a public presence in articles and presses because he entered into the polemical arguments about uh, Christianity versus evolution. But he uh, aspired to cultivate an air of bachelorhood as someone who declined to participate. It was another protest. My own reading, and I don't know if this is shared by other people who've written about him, I've never written about him, is that he had such a terrible family experience. I mean, think of that, to talk about your parents as being brutal and stupid and committing that to writing, that he was decided he didn't want to have a family. That to avoid marriage is to avoid families. Now, I don't say that meaning that that's a cover from my point of view for his homosexuality. I think he was a homosexual. I think he was terrified of being prosecuted for it. And at the same time, I think he was happy to embrace the life of bachelorhood, which is a word that they used for about many men. But the number of close friendships he had with men that he traveled with or lived near is hard to ignore. So maybe there's a way he negotiated a different kind of hunger in his life. I always feel a special poignancy for men and women of the past who either suffered from mental illness, that's not to say heterosexuality, that's a real issue, or gender issues that they couldn't share with anyone they cared about because the world was not there yet. I lament the status of women and children, and things are better, but they're not best, and they were worst for many, many centuries. There was a second person, you said, Michael?
Yeah, something maybe you could elaborate on a little bit before you move on with what you want to say. Ross is asking the question, can you elaborate on how this is a satire of Victorian England? I don't entirely understand that.
Well, I'll begin by saying to criminalize sickness is a satire on Victorian society. That a very progressive society, the height of empire, think about the technological advances, not just the railroad, but so much came afterwards. There was a great exhibition in mid-century Victorian England in London celebrating the success of people's ingenuity. In the 18th century, if you use the word industry, it would have been thought of as a Christian virtue like forbearance or chastity. In the 19th century, it means making stuff, working hard to make stuff. So the idea that if you were not a fully participating member of society, if you were not healthy, that to be sick is to be a criminal, is very Victorian. A Victorian motto is honesty is the best policy. What does honesty is the best policy mean? I'll answer my own question since we're not in a room with a seminar. It means if you're honest, it'll be better for business. An honest butcher will have more customers. You could say honesty will get you to heaven. Honesty will give you peace of mind. Honesty will make you feel better about your fellow human beings and hopefully make them feel better about you. No, the adage is honesty is the best policy. It's very, very capitalistic. It's very bourgeois. It's very self-serving. So a lot of Victorian um, sentiment is sentiment that's masking out morality, but actually has to do with policy. I mean, nobody in this Zoom call should have an ethical perspective that is called policy. Well, you know what my policy is. What is it? Be kind to other people. Oh, that's your policy? So I would start with the idea that the sick are criminalized. And uh, you say, how did that happen in Victorian society? You didn't get sick pay. There was no workers' compensation. And the worker who might be injured might be 10 working in a mine. And when they improved the rules, they made it that you only had to work 8 hours a day instead of 10. And the children worked in mines for the same reason they were chimney sweeps. They could fit into small places. And there was no sense that that's an outrage. When people pointed out that men like Dickens' father were sent to Marshalsea, the debtor's prison, to work off their debt, and that it was inhumane to separate a father from his wife and 6 children, I think, at that point, they did the humane thing and they moved the wife and the 4 youngest children in to the same debtor's prison. And what's more, they separated the husband from the wife and each of them from their children. Why? Because he was a debtor. He owed money. And until he made it back, they could not have anything approaching a familial life. The authorities made it unpleasant so that people would not want to go there. And how do you avoid going there? You pay your debts. In Madame Bovary, one of the world's greatest novels, one of my favorite novels, everyone in town knows that Emma is sleeping around and that her dolt of a husband doesn't have a clue. And nobody does anything about it. And nobody thinks particularly poorly of her. She's a beautiful woman and vivacious. And this is a backwater town. And she gives the place some class. But she's running up a bill with her tailor because she wants to have expensive clothing made after the fashion of what's happening in Paris. And she can't pay her bill. Nobody cared that she was an adulteress. Nobody cared that she ignored her daughter and did unspeakable things sexually in a carriage. I mean, there are references to, I'll say, non-typical sex, really extraordinary in a novel published in mid-19th century. It had to be defended in court against being pornography, and the case was won. But don't pay your bill, and all of a sudden you're in trouble. The society will put up with, I'm using this word for effect, a whore, but not a deadbeat. You owe money, don't come around here. That's very Victorian. And the lack of concern for the poor, for the ill who had no protection. I might have mentioned this before. Michael, you might be able to remind me. Have I mentioned Victoria De Sica's last film, A Brief Vacation?
I don't think so.
I don't think so either. So the excellent filmmaker Victoria De Sica, back in the 70s, I think, produced his last film, which is called A Brief Vacation. I recommend it to you. And what I'm about to tell you will not ruin it because it's not about plot. A woman in northern Italy, the factory industrial part, develops some problem with her lungs. I forget if she works in a factory or a mine. And the doctor tells her, and she works because the family needs a working mother and a working father. The cure is to go to the southern part of Italy and breathe better air. This was quite common, taking the cure in the 19th century. And so despite their needing her salary, she goes down to the south of Italy and she discovers what it is to be free of work. She reads I Promessi Sposi, The Betrothed, the sort of national novel, romantic novel of Italy. She meets a charming person. I won't tell you what happens with them because there are some spoilers, but she gets better, and not just her lungs. I won't tell you what happens at the end of the novel, but the title, A Brief Vacation, is taken from Karl Marx, who says, illness is the brief vacation of the poor. You want time off? Get sick. You won't be paid, but you won't have to work. A lot of the animus in this novel about Victorian is the hypocrisy that they are caring people when in fact they're thinking about policy, not kindness.
Got it. There's actually one or two other comments, unless you want to keep going with something.
Well, I want to, since we're past the midpoint, I want to ask the people to be patient. And if you remember the order, I just want to nod towards some works that are published around this time to give you a sense of the landscape. So the end of the 19th century is filled both with this criticism of Victorian England. When this novel gets published in 1872, Dickens has died 2 years before. And Dickens is a great humanitarian novelist. He's the great Christian novelist without making a big deal about his Christianity. But there were books being published before then. Great Expectations is published in 1861. And there the criminal is treated very differently because of how he looks from his co-defendant, another criminal who just has better hairdo and better clothing. One gets sent to Australia, one gets off. Silas Marner is published in the same year, 1861, which has fairy tale elements about a miser who is redeemed by his love of a little girl. Well, we had a miser in Ebenezer Scrooge, and we don't have a miser, but we have a crotchety old man in Heidi later on in the century who is saved by a little girl. There is a little girl that comes into the landscape in 1865 with Alice in Wonderland. And Alice doesn't take a ship to get to a strange world, but she moves into a world that is as foreign as any of the utopias we look at. It is a world that lacks reason. If it's taught as a children's book, it's about the joy of nonsense, about things not making sense. But you can see it not as it's too much to say that it's a dystopia, but you can see it as a book that is questioning things making sense. And even though it's enjoyable, it's also a little unnerving. It turns out it was all a dream. That's an old kind of dodge. But then a few years later, 6 years later, the same year or a year before this book was published, you have Alice Through the Looking Glass, where now instead of going down a rabbit hole, she goes into a mirror in her home. And we might think that mirrors reflect and repeat, but they reverse. So I part my hair on the left. The guy in my medicine cabinet mirror, he parts his hair on the right. It's not my world repeated, it's my world inverted. And there are inversions in the looking glass that have implications for being a critique of Victorian society. The Queen in that novel says, off with his head. And when it's pointed out, I think by Alice, but I can't swear to that, that they haven't had the verdict yet. And the Queen says, punishment first, verdict later. A formula that would not give some people in the Victorian age or our age now much worry. And when Alice says, how can you have a memory of something that hasn't happened yet? Because the Queen makes reference to something in the future, she refers to it in the past tense. And the Queen says to Alice, who again is a stranger in a strange land, that's part of the motif that connects to these works we're doing. The Queen says to Alice, how does it work in your world? And Alice says, well, you first have to experience something before you can remember it. Very straightforward, very logical. Even kids wouldn't question that. And what does the Queen say? Well, it's a poor sense of memory that only works backwards. One of my favorite lines in all of literature. What's the good of memory if it only works backwards? If you only have to have a thing happen first? I mean, the Queen is imperious. She's turning time around And so Alice in Wonderland, which I recommend to you if you've never read it or haven't read it lately, and Alice Through the Looking Glass are not poignant, powerful books that question the absolute certainty in the primacy of reason, industry, Victorian rigidity, and so on. Later on in the period, some 24 years after this book is published, a fellow Scotsman to Adam Smith, Robert Louis Stevenson, publishes The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It is a monumental hit. One of the reviewers said, even people who don't read literature are reading this book. It was helped by the fact that it was a novella. It's helped by the fact that it is truly scary. It's helped by the fact that people in the day did not know what even teenagers who've never read the book know today, that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is the same person. Part of the power of the novella is that you don't find out for some time that they're the same person. And so people in the good Dr. Hyde's neighborhood are wondering why he would not only be consorting with a criminal and a terrible looking fellow in Mr. Hyde, but he lives with him. And being Victorians, their answer to why they're close is that Mr. Hyde has something wicked on Dr. Jekyll and is blackmailing him. And what could it be? Well, it's the Victorian period. It's something about sex. And when the reader of the day was complacent, thinking, oh, I want to see how this works out, they think it's a mystery story about blackmail. Blackmail after murder is the number one crime in mystery and detective stories through the 20th century because it has to do with appearances and respectability. And then we find out it's a potion and that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are the same person. Why am I talking about that now? Because how are you going to build a society of perfection when the inner lives of human beings can be so distorted and corrupt? They are two halves of the same person. Now, it's going to be decades before Freud's works come to England in English. But if Freud's theories are true, they're true before he names them. What is Dr. Jekyll but the id, Mr. Hyde, but the id of Dr. Jekyll? I go on to elaborate this way because writers of the period were starting to erode the complacency of Victorian England. And the implication for us in this series is, how do you create a perfect society out of people who are not only imperfect, but hypocritical, without self-knowledge, or maybe even corrupt? Now I'll take those other comments. Thank you for waiting.
Okay, Cecilia says, going back to what you were talking about just a little while ago, does the novel go beyond commentary on Victorian England to espouse challenging all cultural assumptions? For example, criminal law based on actions irrespective of context versus criminal law based on health. In other words, do all societies have unexamined implicit assumptions?
Yeah. So that's a very interesting question. And when someone says that, it means the question's better than the answer that's coming. I will say that I don't have deep knowledge of Samuel Butler. My guess is that he did not have in mind the breadth of questioning all cultural assumptions. But if who asked that? Who made that comment?
Celia.
Celia, if you would have put that question to Samuel Butler, my guess is that he would say, I didn't have that in mind when I wrote it, but I certainly think that argument could be made. I say he didn't have it in mind when he wrote it because he had a lot of deep feeling about being anti his family, maybe anti families generally, very much unhappy with English hypocritical dependence on Christianity, the lack of a ethical center. And so I think he is a writer who is much narrower, for example, than Swift. Swift's satire is very broad. He's really talking about mankind. He's referencing and locating it in England, but his satire is very broad. This is a narrower satire, and it's also not as heavy-handed in its invective, which is why if you look the work up in literary criticism, some people will say it's a dystopia, but most will not, that it's more satire than dystopian. But it's a question that can be answered by all of us to say, once he plants a seed, why can't we talk about all cultures? I will say that the word culture is not in use in England until the 19th century. And it comes from the German influence, where the Germans were the first Europeans, anyways, who were interested in what is the medium that makes the things we believe in and do grow. Well, it's like a culture in a petri dish. And the German word is Kultur, and it's one of a handful of words that had a radical change in its meaning, like industry in the 19th century, and people became fascinated by culture. Also, the Victorians, since we're talking about a Victorian novel, had the benefit of a queen who lived long enough that people in the age thought of themselves as Victorians. They also learned the word from Germany of Zeitgeist, the spirit of the time. Nobody in Shakespeare's day thought they were Elizabethans. They knew who was on the throne. Not one of them would have thought we're living in the Elizabethan period. But Victorians, especially by 1872, they thought of themselves as Victorians. And they had very definite, varying from person to person, but very definite ideas of what it meant to be a Victorian. And they also understood the notion of zeitgeist, that there's a cultural period, a cultural sensibility that is broader than any one person or thing, and is very hard to define until you're on the other side of it, until you look back. Okay, Michael, more? Michael, is there more? Sorry, I didn't mean to call you Michael Moore.
That's okay. Yeah. One other comment, reflecting back when you were talking about the science fiction novels and movies and about technology and going awry. And Lynn was just making a comment about Isaac Asimov writing in I, Robot, the famous 3 laws of robotics, which each one in sort of in a building sequence is a promise in some way that no robot will ever do any harm to a human.
Right. The code was that they could not violate these first principles, and one of them is not to do harm. The idea was that it was hardwired into them that they would put altruism, a kind of altruism, above self-interest. But I, Robot is an old collection of stories. I think it was the 1950s. Asimov, who wrote or edited over 500 books, was a force of nature. He's considered one of the three big science fiction writers. Arthur Clarke and Robert Heinlein are the other two. And just an extraordinary man, a biology professor, and a polyglot who wrote on many different things. When he died, the world lost something. But yes, I, Robot was one of the first attempts to suggest things could go wrong unless we program in they not go wrong. But programs get hacked, programs get violated, things devolve, they don't just evolve, things run down. We are, for good or ill, at a point in human history where the things that were science fiction are now science fact. I will say, looking ahead, that one thing that's been missing from this survey, not my fault, is women authors. You are not going to find people writing about utopias in Renaissance England. But we turn next time in The Handmaid's Tale to a focus on a female protagonist, on women in culture, and a great female writer. We take a little detour with King Lear, because King Lear figures prominently in Station 11, which is written by a woman. And we're doing King Lear to ask the question, what is the nature of nature? Also, there are worse things to do in any series than to spend a session on King Lear. If I could work King Lear into the American novel I Woulda. And then we end with Cloud Cuckoo Land, not by a woman, but women figure prominently in that book, which is very much about issues of technological advancement and the whole notion of what to do with a utopia if you find it. We should remember that paradise means a perfect place, but in English tradition, American tradition, European tradition, when you call paradise Eden, you're emphasizing that it is not a perfect place. It's just the opposite. Eden is a paradise that has gone wrong. And what made it go wrong? Human desire. Because the people who fashioned that tale are men, they made the desirous person a woman. But God made this perfect place, this paradise, and had an angel tell Adam and Eve, you can have anything you want except that thing over there. The fruit of that tree is verboten. And Milton would have said the reason the myth says that is there is no righteousness, there's no discipline, there's no morality if there isn't something you cannot do. There must be some limit to what you can do. The apple, it's actually just a fruit, has no value. It's just the thing you can't do. How come I can't? Because I said so. Remember, God's not talking to me directly. Well, it's a woman's desire that mucks it all up. I would say it's human desire, because the one thing that God could not hardwire out of human beings is, even in the perfect world, people want what Oliver wants in Oliver Twist. They want more. They want more. They want more. I have a 4-year-old granddaughter. She wants more. Okay, we said we'd watch 2 little cartoons and now it's time for bed. One more, one more, one more. When Goethe died, he yelled out, mehr Licht, mehr Licht. I just want a little more light, little more. When Faust is dying, what does he say? He wants more time, more time. Everybody wants more. Well, Eve wants more, and you could have more, except God said that's a no-no. And so they fall out of paradise into the real world. Even a paradise made by God and creatures who are closer to angels than human beings, even they muck it up. Take it one step further, and I'll make this my closing comment. Satan is an angel, Lucifer, his name, light, Lucifer, light. Matches used to be called Lucifers. He is a glorified angel in heaven, and he decides that he wants to rebel against God, and he's consigned to hell. And you say, what is it about Lucifer, an angel, that couldn't be happy in paradise? You may know the movies from the 60s or 70s called Bedazzled, with Peter Cook and Dudley Moore. Dudley Moore went on to some fame in Arthur and other movies. Peter Cook did not have the same cinematic success. But Peter Cook and Dudley Moore were wickedly funny comedians in the 60s and 70s. And I recommend, I'm sure some of their comedy bits are on YouTube. But they do a bit in Bedazzled where Peter Cook, the more elegant looking one, is Lucifer talking to the other Dudley Moore about why he was thrown out of heaven. And the mortal, and it's a Faust story. The Bedazzled is a Faust story. The demon has come to tempt Dudley Moore. Dudley Moore says, I don't understand. You're God's favorite angel. You're in paradise. You will never die. Why did you have to rebel? Why couldn't you just be happy? And Dudley Moore says to Peter Cook, the angel Lucifer, gets on top of a trash can, and he says to Dudley Moore, I want you to run around the can and say, glory, glory, glory in the highest to me. And Dudley Moore does that for a good 2 minutes. And then he stops. And he says, I'm getting tired. And the angel says, you got to do it. And he does it for another couple of seconds. And Dudley Moore says, can we change places? And Peter Cook says, aha! Thanks for coming.
That was a very cool way to conclude this. We could go on for a long time about the technology related aspects of this book. If you didn't have a chance to read it, read it. If you don't have time to read the whole book, read those 3 chapters. I guarantee you will be amazed by what you read in there when you think about what's going on now. Otherwise, have a nice evening. Thanks, Mark, for another great one, and we'll see everybody next Thursday.
And for those of you celebrating Yom Kippur this weekend, have a good fast. Let me say, as you read Handmaid's Tale and from then on, keep in mind this issue of deeply embedded human imperfection and how much utopia, the idea of utopia, doesn't give imperfection its due. Thank you, Michael. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody. Good evening.